Welcome to A Quaker Take on God. A Quaker Take is a monthly podcast from Quakers in Britain exploring different perspectives on things that Quakers care about.
So, Elizabeth, what is a Quaker take on God?
I think that's a really big question, John. I think it probably depends on what you mean by God.
Yeah, I think it does depend on the question. It depends who you're talking to. The first ever time I remember telling somebody that I was Quaker or was sort of doing Quaker things was when they asked me what I thought about God, and I was like, "Oh no, I'm a Quaker. Try and flag this up. We have a nuanced view. It's complicated," because I think that particular person was very much coming from a very atheist perspective. Like, you can't believe in God, can you? It's kind of like, well, we can have a nice conversation about that actually. But equally, I've been in situations where I've been in a church building and I've sort of said, it's a different context. People have different understandings, and you often don't know what people's understanding is.
Yeah, I think a lot of assumptions get made about, especially when the word God is used, lots of people assume that they know what you mean when you're talking about it, which makes the conversation quite difficult because you're not quite sure how to open it. And so really I think with this episode what we're trying to do is to open up that conversation and say, what do we mean when we're talking about this? What do we mean by the language that we use? How are we having this conversation? How do we have this conversation well?
Yeah. I think we struggle with it as Quakers, actually. But I don't know if struggle is the right word, because actually I think the Quaker perspective on God is actually, how does your experience of the world and of the divine speak to you? And so that's where you end up with the different takes on God, and you end up with perhaps the outside world not always being clear on what Quakers think about God.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think one of the things I really liked about Quakers was that they often didn't always use the word God, that the word spirit was used quite a lot, or the word divine, which is it sometimes feels a little bit looser. I mean, that a lot of that language obviously has the Christian roots. Really, spirit is just a contraction of Holy Spirit and things, but it allows people to hold what it is that they believe in a sort of quite loose frame, but is still held.
Yeah, spirit seems quite useful, but of course one of the things you learn as you kind of go around different Quaker circles is people will use different words. God, goddess. Some people don't like any of that language at all, but that we all have a sense of something, or a sense of validity in terms of the practice and the way that we live.
Yeah, but as you say, it's often been something that Quakers don't talk about very well, is that spiritual experience and what happens in Quaker meeting and all of those kinds of things, which I think over the last few years we've been trying to do a lot more of. And that can often lead to a lot of confusion when people hear about what we've been doing. So all the articles earlier this year.
Yes, there was a great Simon Jenkins article. It was actually quite interesting about Quakers, but it had the title "Quakers are right to get rid of God," which had a few Quakers sort of going, "Did we? I don't think we did get rid of God," which then led to actually really good discussion, both within Quakers and more broadly about, the language that we use.
I still think one of the most useful phrases within Quaker faith and practice as it stands at the moment, it says something along the lines of like, the deeper realities of Quaker faith are beyond precise verbal formulation. And I think that sums up quite well how tricky it can be to talk about what we mean by, when we're talking about spiritual experiences, what we mean by all of this. And there's a lot of trust that is needed when having that conversation, because you don't just walk up to someone in the street and be like, "So, do you believe in God?" I mean, some people do, but
some people do it to people on podcasts, actually.
Yes, we're not going to do that. This is a sort of more of an introduction into that topic from people who have different thoughts and different perspectives, and for some people that has changed over time, because this isn't something that is static. So yeah, we thought we would invite you into a conversation that was had a few weeks ago when it was at the height of summer. So the windows were a little bit open, so you might hear a few bits of traffic noise and things, but we hope you enjoy listening.
So we're having a conversation about a Quaker take on God, I'm Alistair Fuller. I'm Head of Ministry and Outreach for Quakers in Britain, and I'm joined by 4 other Quakers here this evening, and I'm just going to ask them to introduce themselves.
Hello, my name's Maud. My mum first took me to Quakers when I was 4. I applied to be a member when I was 16, and I'm now in the beginnings of taking my children to Quakers and seeing them begin to learn about Quakerism.
My name's Bruce, and I grew up in Quakers, but I can firmly say that I had no idea what Quakers were about whatsoever by the time I'd left school, and came back to Quakers much later in life. I joined 10 years ago.
I am Wendy. I worship in Lancashire, and I have been going to a Quaker meeting for about 25 years.
I'm fairly new to Quakers, although I have been knocking around now for a little while, having found Quakers at university, and I currently sort of float around wherever I find a Quaker meeting that's convenient or I feel drawn to.
Thank you. So we're going to ask, and what I want to ask is, what does the word God mean to you in your life, and especially in your life as a Quaker? So what does the word God mean to you? I'm going to start, Maud, if I can, with you.
Yeah, I suppose ever since you asked me to do this, I've been thinking about it quite a lot. And I think, like, in all honesty, and I suppose I'm not very often very honest with myself in terms of a health condition that I have, but one of the symptoms of that health condition is that I often struggle to find the right word that I'm looking for in my mind. So I tend to use the word God as often the most easily found word to describe something which I guess is still indescribable, and I have great struggles with the clarity around what I mean by that. So I find the whole conversation around different words and what people feel comfortable with or don't feel comfortable with very tricky, because for me it's not a case of which word feels right, it's which word can my brain allocate at any one time. So I suppose when I'm with a group of people worshipping, it's quite easy to feel like I'm in a shared space with people waiting for some kind of clarity around what we're hearing or what we're feeling. My challenge is when speaking to people who aren't as familiar with Quaker worship or with Quakers, how do I use a language that I have trouble accessing to describe something which I can't describe without saying, please destroy me in worship and let's figure this out together, which is probably where I feel most comfortable. But if I'm pushed to a specific, I think it's that moment of clarity where I feel God is closest to me. And that's not often my clarity. That might be somebody else's clarity about where they think I am. And I think it's those moments where you feel like a mirror is being held up to you, that I feel like I'm being seen by God and I can see God clearly.
Thank you. Bruce, can I ask that same question now to you?
Yes. I said I'd come into my membership 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago. And I say with total confidence that I've spent a good 9 of those years as an agnostic, as a slightly jealous agnostic, because it seemed to me that the people around me in the Quaker community who had some sense of God had something that I was missing. And the more I've been in Quakers, the more I've recognized that there's something bigger going on than the rational, than the here and now, than the physical, than what we can identify purely with thought. And I say that 9 of those years have been spent agnostic, but I suppose searching for something that would provide that greater meaning. I personally, I'm uncomfortable with the word God. It carries with it a whole load of baggage around institutionalized religion, the hymns we sung at school, the prayers, the words of other people. And towards the end of my agnosticism, the thing that gave me comfort was the thought that I could experience something that was irrational, that was mystical, that was bigger than words, because I'd been fortunate enough to be in love. And love, that sort of overwhelming sense of connectedness, the power of the universe, there's something wonderful and extraordinary about that feeling. And I was waiting for it to sort of come as a manifestation of my religion. The idea that there's something bigger, that there's something more important, and there's something that we all can connect to in our lives that gives us a significance. Gives us a significance? No, it gives life a significance that empowers us, that enriches us. So I spent most of my time as a Quaker living on the principle that there could be something bigger. And more recently, I've found a way of accessing that it's real and it's powerful. And there are times when it happens in a meeting for worship, and it's just extraordinary. But it makes my skin crawl slightly having to try and talk about it, because whenever I try and put it into words, it's a bit like a wisp of smoke. It just, you can't grab it, you can't get hold of it. And trying to rationalize it is counterintuitive. Experience it. And as a sort of experience-based faith, I suppose that's what draws me to Quakerism, is that it's about the power of personal experience and what we can do to get closer to the divine, the light, the God, the eternal, the mysticism, whatever words you're comfortable with.
Thank you. Wendy, can I ask you?
So, first of all, I have been uncomfortable with the word God for a long time. And maybe I should say I had been uncomfortable with the word God for a long time. And until I started coming to meeting, was fairly adamant that there was no such thing. I now accept the word God as a shorthand, knowing that using it as a shorthand, everybody might be using it in a different way to mean something different for themselves. And the advantage of the shorthand is that we don't have to explain what we mean, because it's something that's impossible to put into words, but it allows us to have the conversations about something that's outside of our everyday experience, unless we're focusing on it. So I would say for me that it's about a sense of. So what God is shorthand for me is a sense of being part of the whole creation. It's a sense of being small and insignificant, which actually makes me feel really good. And it's a kind of sense of being in a different state of consciousness than when I'm doing practical everyday things, though the two can combine. And it's also a sense of love and connection.
Thank you. And John?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already said so much. I think what's the first time I wanted to call myself a Quaker was when somebody asked me if I believed in God after I'd attended meeting for worship for a while, and I sort of stuttered and I sort of thought, no, yes, maybe, just I'm a Quaker. There's the nuance here. So I think it's interesting, the change in society. I think saying that you believe in God is quite hard to do these days in a way that maybe it wasn't always. And I think the fact that Quakers have a kind of looser framework there, and you must believe in this thing, is helpful, although it does also make it somewhat challenging, I think, at times. But for me personally, yes, I've gone through a similar process of being able to reconcile myself to that word, but I don't think I would ever say to somebody I believed in God. I think I find that challenging. And I always find spirit helpful in a kind of sense that spirit can mean a Christian sense, but it can mean something a bit more broad, and it can encompass many different things. I guess for me, one of the reasons I've walked away from more traditional Christianity was this idea that there is a clear path, and the idea that it was so structured, and that classic question of why would only Christians go to heaven, or those kinds of questions. And for me, there's something about God that's still tied up with my upbringing of God being that judge and that sort of classic kind of cartoon character of the man in the sky that I find really unhelpful. And I guess one of the things that's interesting about working in a job having to communicate Quakers so often is you gain so much by using that word, and you lose so much by using that word, and you do vice versa. It's become a really provocative word, which I think is why it's become so significant a question, and obviously it sparked so much external interest. That whole question of are Quakers getting rid of God that happened recently, because some people were like, yes, please do, and some people were like, goodness me, if they do, it's the end of everything. And yeah, but I'm curious as to your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the real challenges can be not so much where am I with this, but what's it? Yeah, I guess what does it mean for me to talk to somebody else about it? And in my own story, in my own experience, I don't think I ever went through that whole thing of God being a difficult or uneasy word. And I think that was because I have no memory at all of ever, even as a child, having that judgmental man in the sky kind of image, really, of God. I think for me, there's something about the word God that always felt like it resonated, that it was something vast and other and beyond, and also that was sort of intimate and loving. And so I think for me, when I use it as a way of describing my experience, that isn't a difficult thing for me to do. I'm not just saying to myself, okay, I'll kind of use this word because it's the only one that's there to hand. For me, it does speak of an experience that's, profound and transforming and rich. What's much more difficult, I think, is if somebody says to me, so what does it mean to be a Quaker? What happens in Quaker worship? Because I'm always conscious of, so where's this word for you? Where's this language for you? If I use this word, which for me feels, I don't mean that I have some fabulous hotline to God and that it's, it ebbs and flows, and sometimes it feels empty and distant, and other times it feels absolutely real and immediate. But I think for me that there's always been a challenge about how do I use this word? What words can I use? What language can I find that might help you to find a way into understanding this experience? And conscious that as soon as we put that kind of word to it, that there are all kinds of people for whom that's just alienating. It just becomes a hurdle, and I don't want that hurdle to be there. But at the same time, I do need to have a way and a word and some kind of language that will say something about it, that will say that this isn't just, that this is an experience for me of something that is other and beyond and intimate and loving at the same time. And that's quite a long sentence to keep using when I could say God. So, yeah. And I think I'm also conscious that God often feels much more immediate and real, whatever we might mean by that, when I'm in worship than, kind of when I'm sort of caught up in all the ordinariness and kind of busyness of everyday life. And I don't mean that God's absent from that, but that sense of that nearness and intimacy and otherness is much more present, I think, in worship for me. And I wonder, for each of you, how that feels. Is God something that you would be consciously, I don't know, engaging with or thinking about or reflecting on, particularly in that space of worship? Or is it something that you feel conscious of, that you're responding to in kind of in the everyday? Bruce?
Yeah. For the time that I spent grappling with being religious without a sense of God, the thing that I found made it most accessible was the first of our advices and queries. Take heed, dear friends, to the promptings of love and truth in your hearts. Trust them as the leadings of, and here comes the G word, God, which shows us our darkness and brings us to new light. And I just lobbed an extra O into the middle of God and turned it in my head into good. I can believe in good. I can believe in love and truth. And I can find it enriching in the way I approach my life and the way I behave in relation to other people by trying to find that love and truth in the everyday as well as in worship. So that for me was the access point, the love and the truth, the sort of enduring and mystical things, if you like, attached to the word good.
Thank you.
I tend to think about God most days. I think there are not that many days when I don't think about God. I remember I used to be really afraid to tell people that I believed in God and that I was a Christian, sort of for fear of being scorned or laughed at or ridiculed. And actually, it's only in the last few years that I've become braver at that. And I'm always most nervous when I go and see my hairdresser. I don't know why. I've got a thing about telling hairdressers the not truth. And my experience has been actually, but by telling her that I'm a Christian, that I believe in God, we've had some really interesting conversations, and she's not religious at all, but that's given me a lot of bravery to talk to other people. And one of my favourite things is talking to people about the nature of belief, whether they're Christians or Quakers or Sikhs or Muslim or from other faiths. I find it really fascinating to talk to people. A Sikh friend, I went to a talk about pilgrimage, and he said to me, if you can't see God in all, you can't see God at all. And I suppose from then I've thought that God is in everything I do and with me always. Sometimes that's much clearer to me than in other times. But I often feel like I'm being accompanied through life by something. And I suppose perhaps growing up in Quakers, I've never really experienced I don't want to say baggage, but I've never really had different experiences of God other than that within the Quaker faith, which has always been quite a broad room, a big room for me to explore that within. So I have no hesitation in feeling very comfortable that I believe in God and God is with me every day.
Thank you.
I think that's interesting because for me, being what attracted me to Quakers was the fact that it can hold at that end that atheist belief as well as the Christian within it. That we have Quakers who consider themselves atheist and we have Quakers who consider themselves Christian. It was always really important to me as someone sort of sliding around that spectrum. And I sort of found that helpful, and sometimes I think I don't always feel that kind of deep assurance that there's something out there or that's with me, and I kind of have to go into a sort of quite rational space and think about what is it? Are we referring to? What is it? Are we experiencing? Is it just emotions? But even if it is, does that then are they God? And have that space and that openness when approaching this slightly strange faith group was quite important. And but I think what we've all kind of been saying is that so much is about experience that then you, of course, struggle to put it into words. And I wonder if whether, because Quakers, I don't know, because we don't write stuff down and say you have to think this, generally. I wonder, yeah.
But for me, that's one of the things that I like most. You hear Quakers talking about their spiritual journey. And I did a membership visit recently, and the person we were visiting said the first time she came to a Quaker meeting, she knew nothing about it, and she sat down and saw the Bible and the Quran on the table in front of her, and she took that to be a really good sign. And the thing that she found most attractive is that being a member doesn't mean that you have to have this tick box, yes, I believe, yes, I believe, yes, I do this, yes, I do that. That Quakers are always talking about this journey where our lives are enriched by being Quakers and amongst Quakers and trying to bring that of God into everything and everybody. And you never get there. You never get there. You never get to the top of the mountain and think, right, that's it. I can see it all. It's just this wonderfully enriching journey that gets better and better the longer you do it, for me.
Thank you. Wendy, were you about to say something? Or
So just reminding myself of the question that are we reflecting on that, whatever God is, particularly in worship or in the everyday? I think it's easier in worship sometimes, but that in worship, that sensation of having ministry, of being given something that you need to say to the group that you're worshipping with, that kind of physical feeling and the feeling that you're being prompted and that those words are coming from more than you. That same feeling can happen any other day, any other time as well. And kind of unbidden comes into, it's kind of like a bodily sensation, really, that sense of having that big connection, if you like, is possible at any moment, really. And some things make it more likely, like doing something with other people, doing something that feels right. And it's at any time where there's a sense of kind of having more power or agency than I have on my own, that can come into whatever, on any day. And and even when meeting for worship can be a little bit barren and I don't really want to go, I still get that sensation in other parts of my life.
Yeah.
With other groups of people.
Yes.
I think there's something about the fact that there is no day that is sacred within Quakerism. There is no buildings that are sacred, and that kind of tradition of certainly Quaker history I find very interesting. That here was a group of people that were just meeting in houses or on hillsides or wherever, and it was quite an organic thing, and that we've sort of tried to, one of the things somebody said to me was about how early Quakers were on fire. They had this experience, they had this thing that they wanted to share with the world and go around and tell people about it. And I think fire is a really interesting thing, and it's the thing that I use most as a kind of metaphor for the divine. And I think when you're in meeting for worship, sometimes you can see that sort of that light and that fire, and you're sort of bringing your sort of fire together, and it's warm. Sometimes it's less so, and sometimes I'll be sitting in the pub, and maybe there'll be a few Quakers there, maybe a few people who aren't Quakers, and I still get that same kind of sense of here are these people together with this fire within them, and sometimes it lights up in their eyes, and usually that's when it is that stuff that's sort of being prompted to do something about the world, or talking about really powerful experience that you've had, whether that be something, something around meeting a loved one, or something more challenging around death or troubles, or wanting to go and do witness. I see that. So I think worship can be really helpful, but it is something that's always there, and it sort of flares up and it's kind of slightly out of control. But if you're with other people, it comes more to the front.
Yeah. I wonder, do you think, I mean, we've talked about our own experience of worship and our own, I suppose, sort of understanding of what we mean by God, or how we might or might not use that language. I wonder how it feels being part of a community of faith where all of those people who you're worshipping with, it's not just that they'll have a slightly different way of phrasing it, but that their understanding of what's here at the heart of it all might be profoundly different from yours. And how does it feel for you worshipping and being part of that faith community? Does that feel like a real gift to have that kind of breadth? Does it feel like a real struggle? Do we hold that tension well? Or I wonder how that is.
I think lots of meetings experience it differently. I feel like I'm in a meeting now which is really trying very hard to get to know each other, so that we're not just making assumptions about what other people are thinking or believing, but that we're actually talking to each other. And I think getting to know each other better is key. I remember talking to a group of people about how I understood the Quaker nature of testimony. And afterwards, somebody said, I really like your description, but I think it would alienate anyone who has any difficulty with traditional religious language, Christian language. And then somebody next to them said, well, do you have trouble with traditional Christian language? And they said, oh, no, not me, but I just think other people might have trouble. And he said, well, I don't like traditional Christian language, but I absolutely loved what Maud said about testimony. So I think we can make assumptions about what people will find difficult. But I think if we stop talking to each other, then we lose what it means to be in community with each other. There's a brilliant passage somewhere in Quaker Faith and Practice, isn't it, that community is not being with the people that you want to be with. It's sometimes being with the people that you least want to be with.
Yes.
And so for me, the diversity of belief within Quakers is a real gift, but it's only a gift if we talk to each other and get to know each other and try and understand each other. I think as soon as we stop trying to get along and trying to work out where each other are coming from, then it becomes something that can be quite difficult and isolating and threatening, perhaps, to a Quaker identity.
So I've been part of an interfaith friendship group, and in that group there were a lot of differences, as you might imagine. And we had sessions where we focused on things that were our similarities rather than thinking about our differences, because whenever we thought about our differences, the whole interfaith friendship group struggled. People didn't want to come. And I think to some extent the same is true in meeting. There are some things, like at the base of it, that we have in common. There are similarities that we have, even though they may be overlaid with things that are very different about the way that we understand things or frame things in words or act. And I think that there is a tension, but where there's tension, there's energy, there's dynamism, there's opportunity to change, there's the need for dialogue, and that is all very positive. But I think that words are difficult, like we've said before, but that community is essential for what we do, and that, given the differences in our communities, and every meeting will have really quite big differences between the way people put things or behave or understand things, that we know when we've got something right because everybody agrees. And that's hugely powerful. that we have the opportunity to express our differences, that is a rare thing in worshipping communities, and that's a flag. When we don't disagree, it's a big flag. You're on the right track.
A good friend recently managed to nail for me the power of the meeting for worship by explaining it as meeting three things. We meet ourselves in a spirit of truth and peace, to find the peace within oneself and to be honest in the way we see ourselves, and having a sense of integrity in everything that we do is a challenge in its own right. But we also meet with each other in a spirit of equality. And one of the most important things in that meeting for worship, when meeting with others, is the listening. And that takes us through to the third thing that we meet, and that is the divine. And listening for the big stuff, listening, as Wendy was saying, that sense of unity when we come together and have that powerful sense of connectedness to the bigger stuff, the important stuff, that the flag is there saying, yeah, you're going on the right track. That for me is the great power of being part of a faith community. And it comes in meeting for worship, but it also comes whenever friends come together and can embody these testimonies, these principles behind the Quaker way.
I think Quakers have got it good, but I don't think we've got it perfect. And I don't think that when I see those moments, I don't always see it as an explicitly Quaker thing. I think sometimes when I'm in community with other people of other faiths or none, I will see that. And I think that's possibly why Quakers at the moment have an interesting relationship with membership and things like that, because I think that profound experience is sort of fostered by Quakers and Quakerism and the practices that we live and the traditions that we bring. But I think it's like part of a garden that we're very good at making it flower, but it's not all of our garden. I don't know if that's a very bad metaphor. I'm just trying to think of it. But like, I feel like there's something important about being in a Quaker community, and there's something important about being a Quaker. But those profound moments that I consider to be Quaker, I sometimes find happening not in the Quaker community all the time. And I find that interesting then to think about. And I also find that interesting to think about. I do tend to think that we're pointing at something, and on a day when I wake up and I think there is no God, I cannot rationalize that there is a God, but I can rationalize that I'm having these processes and these thoughts and I'm going out and living in this way because of reasons. I don't know if that's meant much different to a day when I will feel profoundly moved and be really convinced of God. And I don't know whether actually fundamentally this thing is any different on those days. And that leads me to the question, which I think is a question, is are we all pointing towards the same thing? Are we all kind of experiencing the same thing ultimately, but our experience is so different? And is that the same thing that Quakers have experienced all over the world? Is it, if you're a Muslim Quaker or an atheist Quaker or a Christian Quaker, are you actually a different framework for the same thing? I don't know.
Yeah. Bruce, you want to respond to that?
I do, absolutely. But I mean, that was there at the earliest beginnings of Quakers, when that fabulous story that's told by Margaret Fell of George Fox asking to be allowed to speak in the church, and he stood up on his pew and he said that the Gospels say that and Jesus said that, but what canst thou say? Are you a child of the light? And that thing about Quakers, yes, it is personal, and yes, it's probably all different for everybody, but that's the great power of it in a way, that we all bring our own particular bit of it. What canst thou say? We're not absolving our religion to someone in power who gets to decide what we all have to do or how we do it. You know, you live in the Quaker community, you live in the Quaker way by being individual. Why would you want to be anything else? Be yourself. Everyone else is taken.
Yes. I was really persuaded, if I'm really helpful, something that Maud was saying about, you know, the part of this, part of being in a faith community where there is that kind of breadth of understanding and belief, and possibly, you know, I suppose, John, as you were saying, you know, that breadth of what you're actually experiencing. That for me, I think that the key to all of that is less and less, or it feels, as time goes on, it feels less and less about the words we use and how we describe it, as the charity and the openness with which we listen to the experience of others. And I think for me, what feels important about my Quaker faith and sort of walking this path as a spiritual path, or sort of being in this place, isn't so much, right, I've just got to be able to really crystallize and frame and phrase what I think so beautifully that everybody will have to agree with it. I think for me, what's been most powerful in that journey has been encountering people and walking alongside and being in community with people whose expression of it is so different from mine, whose, I don't mean their experience of it, but certainly the way that they frame that experience of it is so different. But it's always felt so powerful and profound and such a privilege when they've shared that with me. And I think that for me, what's been most shaping and most deepening and enriching has been more about my listening than it has about my being able to frame this. But I wonder how this has changed for you over the time that you've been a Quaker, how it continues to change and what that change feels like.
Yeah, I don't mind saying about that. Also, just thinking about some of the things just now about, are we all experiencing this thing which we might call God, or a million other words? And I suppose for me, you can see a consistency of experience from early friends to friends today and how they've talked about God. I mean, there's a lot of things that have changed, but there's a lot of things that early Quakers cared about and were passionate about that I think friends today still are. And I think if there wasn't a consistency of spiritual experience, then we wouldn't still have that.
Mm.
So I think there has been something. In terms of how my experience of God has changed in my life as being a Quaker, I grew up in Quakers, so naturally as a teenager I absolutely rejected everything I'd ever been told, and found it very difficult. And then I lived in Madagascar for a short period, and there was only 2 or 3 of us in meeting for worship, and I found that very spiritually isolating. I felt very disconnected, and I think my understanding of the nature of God changed because so much of it had been wrapped up in worship with the community and with other people, and tried as I might, 2 to 3 people just didn't feel like enough. And I remember writing home and asking for help and not really feeling like I, even though people were very supportive, that I had that spiritual community. So coming back to the UK and worshipping with others has been very important to me. And I really support all the work going on to support isolated friends around the world. And now I suppose with having a health condition, I've had to let go of a lot of things. And part of that has been language. And so just using the words that feel right at the time, whether that's God or motorbike or dustbin, in the hope that my community is with me and understands that there's something going on behind the language. And there's been times that have been hugely frustrating. I always felt like with God, there should just be one clear message and one clear path. And when life has sent me in 2 or 3 directions, all of which feel like they're what I'm supposed to be doing, and yet they're not compatible with each other. That's tough. And for me, that's when I go back to my community and ask for help and ask for assistance. And that this mystical something of something isn't enough without the people who carry a part of that. And so whether it's that of God, which live within each of us, or that of good, I don't mind, as long as it's there with somebody.
Who knows whether I wouldn't have changed naturally in 25 years. You know, I've got older and more sensible. My lifestyle has changed radically. Everything changes over time, doesn't it? But I think there's two things that are definitely a part of being a Quaker that I've learned, even though I can't always do them, that I am definitely more patient. Some people would argue with this, but they didn't know me before. That I've learned that sometimes I have to not say something. I have to do nothing. I have to wait until I know that it's right, rather than just respond. I've got better at that. I mean, you know, maybe something about sitting in worship for an hour every Sunday or 3 times a week sometimes is good at helping you not to voice everything that comes into your head. There's something else as well that I feel bound in some way, not tied to, but in the sense that, you know, you're bound to do something. So something isn't right, I'm bound to do something. I'm bound to act in ways that I'm prompted, that if I feel supported, I think I can do. I'm bound to try harder as well, because being surrounded by a community of more or less like-minded people stops you from feeling freakish because you want to act on things, and enables you to act.
Coming to Quakers while going to university is a really interesting thing, and I know that's not actually quite a lot of people find Quakers at that time, and I think it's interesting to try and separate what is part of that coming of age thing and what is explicitly a Quaker thing. But one of the things that when I grew up, I would always say no to everything. I was very risk averse. And this might sound a little bit amusing to people who may know a lot about Quakers, but being a Quaker has actually flipped that on its head for me, and that notion, you know, Quakers have that phrase of living adventurously and trusting the leadings of God, has really been useful for me, because when an opportunity arises, my previous instinct was to just immediately say no. And interestingly, by adopting that kind of process of either having a community of people that you can ask, or having that process of every week sitting in silence, meeting I attended for 5 years, it was only half an hour, but that for me, at the time I was at, was exactly what I needed to reflect upon things, meant that actually I ended up saying yes to things way, way more than I would have done. And I think that for me is absolutely tied up with being a Quaker, and that's led me to do things I wouldn't have done. And that idea of being kind of guided by God, I guess, I suppose, has been helpful in that. And so I've, you know, moving to London. It was not something I would have ever dreamed of doing. I've been on rallies that I never would have gone on. I've done all sorts of things other than that. I think Quakers sometimes can go on a lot about Quaker history, a bit too much maybe. And sometimes we can kind of put it on a big plinth and say, this is what we are and this is who we are. But actually for me, seeing that, understanding where the origins of this is and how we are now, has been really helpful to reconcile a lot of the language that I was completely rebelling against when I came to Quakers. Here was a religious community that was barely religious that I could go to without having to believe in God. And yet, by understanding early friends, understanding what they were trying to do and reframing that in a context of actually what was Jesus about has meant that I've become much more comfortable with that kind of language and kind of reclaimed it. And hanging around more and more with Quakers also kind of means suddenly when you're saying the word of God, it's not in the context of people around you who are going to chastise you for saying it. It's people who have a more nuanced view. And I think that's possibly why then it's hard to talk about it in the outside world. And so I think that's possible for me anyway. That's why I see certain people who, come 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I would have said absolutely Quakers cannot use the word God, because that for me is just a barrier. It's a barrier to so many people, and it's so troubling and it's so difficult. I can't believe it, because I thought I found a group of people that didn't really use that word, when actually the worshiping community I was part of just kind of got on with it and never really talked about that sort of thing too much. I found really helpful. But now I see the importance of that, and I've really kind of moved around. And I don't think everyone goes on that journey, but I think a lot of people do. I think it's fair to say. Yeah, I guess my position on God has shifted a lot. And I found myself about a few months ago using it. And I wasn't using it in a like kind of other people use this word, or I'm going to use this word because it's helpful to you. I found, this is the most useful word in this context. Yeah. Blimey, that's interesting. That's a bit of a 360. So, yeah.
And for me, I think some of that change can feel quite tidal. Not tidal is perhaps not the right word. I don't mean it just ebbs and flows. But yes, I can see that whatever the journey is, if journey is the right sort of metaphor, I think for me, the idea of talking about it as a journey always suggests that we go from one bit and then on to the next and on to the next, as if there's. And for me, it's felt much more fluid than that. And there have been times when I felt overwhelmingly close to and persuaded by and prompted by what I would describe as God. And it's just felt really immediate and very, very powerful. And then there have been times when it's been like looking at it through thick glass. It's almost felt kind of abstracted, it was just so kind of distant, and I haven't felt any sort of connection with it at all. And I thought, gosh, I've moved to a different place. But then you kind of find yourself in another place again that's a little bit more like the one that you thought you'd left. And so I think that there's something quite fluid and sometimes slightly kind of unpredictable about that journey, which I suppose in a way is inevitably part of being part of a faith community that is so open, so willing to be still, so willing to be changed and challenged. And so, yes, where I am with all of this today, if we were having this conversation tomorrow, I might be saying something quite different.
I really appreciate that. It's quite a hard thing to do, to come and have this conversation and know that it's being recorded. So
it's important enough, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all.
So how was that conversation for you, John?
Yeah, I think it's not the sort of thing that happens every day. I mean, it goes without saying, but I think I'm not one of these people that talks about God so much in that kind of way, and particularly having lots of different people with different perspectives, and you're hearing things from people and you're like, oh wow, yeah, that's really profound, or oh, I don't quite agree with that, but it's interesting that you would think that, or I found that it meant that I was then more willing to say stuff. And for me, that's also an illustration of like, if you get the conditions right, you don't need like a man in a frock to bring all of that out. Like, we all have our stuff to say.
Yeah, as long as we're all willing to hold that conversation together, actually it creates that connection that allows people to be open.
Yeah, and different things work for different people, obviously.
How do you find that as a Quaker you find spiritual nurture?
Yeah, I mean, that to me is a question that I don't necessarily know how to answer. But I think if I'm thinking about it, I would say meeting for worship is obviously an important part of it, but it's more those conversations with people that I find myself energized when I have rich conversations with people. And I find more often than not that is with Quakers, but not always. And that can be at work, or it can be in the pub, or it can be after a meeting, or whatever, or on a walk. And seeing the kind of life within another person and what their desires are and their troubles and what they're striving to do, I would say I find that more nourishing than anything else.
Okay.
But there's an element of it, I think, that's all linked up. Spiritual nurture is about your whole life, and there's an element of, actually, I think, just personal well-being. You're nurturing the spirit if you're nurturing yourself. And so actually making space to connect with nature or yourself. I walk a lot. Maybe that's part of a spiritual practice.
A few years ago I did some trauma awareness training,
Mm-hmm.
and we did sort of the personal well-being kind of wheel thing, and you're supposed to plot on the different points of the wheel, like how much of this do you do to sort of help you identify where some of those things may be missing or it's a little bit unbalanced.
Mm-hmm.
The idea being that you should be able to join all the dots up and it creates a nice wheel and it creates a nice circle. And for me it became very clear when I did that actually, like, the spiritual side of things, I hadn't really allowed myself to open up and deepen that. And so that's something I think I've probably been trying to figure out how I want to do that and what I do to do that.
Yeah.
And I just coming back from Greenbelt and having had lots of these kinds of conversations with people that have really felt quite enriching.
Mm-hmm.
Being open myself and also listening to other people being open and just holding that rather than judging it, which is I think sometimes how I feel nervous about having these conversations, because I feel like anything that I say will be judged by the other person. So there's something about being able to hold that conversation in the spirit in which you're having it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about like space, and I suppose that's why so often these kinds of conversations I think can happen. There needs to be an element of vulnerability there, maybe.
Yeah.
And so I find actually, if I think of the only time I've had this type of discussion with my family, it's been like at funerals.
Your family sounds a lot healthier than mine. We make jokes about the...
Yeah, there's plenty of jokes, but also like the occasional, like, just not a long conversation, but a reference to what people might think.
Yeah, I've often found that's the only space at which I found out what various family members or friends feel about like whether there's life after death, whether there isn't. And that can sometimes be quite surprising. I found some of the ways in which different people have told their kids about what's happened interesting, because I didn't realise that... I didn't know that their conception of the world also included this.
Yeah. I mean, and maybe you don't know what they think at a given moment in time. Or when people are in trouble or feeling difficult, or you have a difficult conversation with somebody about something that can kind of open up, or at 3 a.m. or whatever, like, that's kind of where we happen.
Do you find that you have a spiritual practice that helps keep you grounded or opens you up for conversation?
I don't know. I mean, for example, my relationship with Quaker Meeting for Worship is that when it's happened spontaneously, or I've taken a lot from it, but I don't get excited about it. But I do feel drained if I don't go. And in terms of spiritual practice, I find that my approach is mainly to find people who are quite spiritual and quite like rich, and just kind of hope it rubs off on me. I don't have the like, I do a diary, or I meditate, or I go to churches. Although I do think that there are some places in the natural world or man-made places that have a certain sort of feel to them that help you kind of get into that headspace. But no, I don't. Yeah, for me it's more about the people actually, and about the conversations you have, and that's what I really value about being part of a Quaker community, is that you have lots of different people who have different perspectives, and that's, for me, it's just like a bonus, because you get all these different things that rub off on you and help you then continue with your questioning of it all. What about you?
I was just actually thinking about possibly the most recent, quite powerful experience that I had was I was at the March for Our Lives rally in Washington DC earlier this year, and
Well travelled.
I was there visiting a friend, and my friend wanted to go to this rally, and and I did not want to go, so I went along, kind of not really knowing what to expect and knowing as much as a British person can possibly really understand about American gun politics. And we stood there in the crowd, and it was really packed. It was one of the youngest protests I think I've ever been on. And when Emma Gonzalez stood up and spoke, and she held the silence, and it was one of the most powerful moments of upholding I think I ever felt. Because nobody spoke, nobody questioned what was happening. Everyone just held the silence in the crowd, and it was really incredibly moving. I've no idea what it must have been like seeing that happened on TV, but certainly within the crowd itself, and hearing there were two chants that kind of came up again. I think it was Never Again and Enough is Enough came up, and it kind of bubbled up like ministry does in Quaker meetings, and then it just sat there, it just stayed, and we held it, and it kept going. I found that actually very powerful and moving, and kind of it helped centre the whole of that rally in a very different way. But probably one of the things that I do on a most regular basis is actually listen to other podcasts. So I found the Sacred podcast a particularly enriching listen. I also read lots of books.
I just wanted to say about your experience in Washington. It's really interesting because I think, as you say, it was like a ministry bubbling up. I think your Quakers don't have a monopoly on it. It's not something that we own, any of this stuff. So I think that's a really interesting thing, and that's also a really fascinating eloquence of the idea that action, witness, activism, whatever words you use, and the kind of spiritual experience are not divorced from each other, and that like we are humanity, and often people who, certainly with something like that, who are called to kind of go and make a stand in what they see as kind of in favour of humanity and suffering and things like that isn't divorced from spirituality, and from, it's not something that happens in churches and on Sundays, and the two completely intersect, and they have those moments where it's really obvious that they do like that. But like if you're called to go and do something for another person on a personal level, or on a like a really broader level like that, then that is about each other, and about that is kind of a spiritual thing. It's like a godly thing in some ways. I don't know. I think one of the things that Quakers are trying to do is say that if we have a conversation like that, you don't spend too much time worrying about how people might perceive what you might say, or how you hear what other people say, and that if you can create a space where you're comfortable with what everyone is, there's a certain level of comfort in what everyone's saying, then you open up that. Whereas if you find yourself in a space where you're angry because this person didn't use the word God, or you're angry because this person did use the word God, or whatever, then you suddenly, like, it's gone.
Yeah.
Like whatever presence there is gone. Like you've lost that connection, you've lost that space to have that conversation properly.
Isn't there something in Advices and Queries about having...
I mean, there's like loads of things.
Yeah,
this basically runs throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, running throughout the whole thing of being like, don't be afraid about hearing ministry that may not speak to you but may speak for others, or speak to others within the meeting or within the space that you're having.
Don't be afraid to use the language that
is comfortable for you.
Comfortable for you.
Yeah. So I guess that's really what a Quaker take on God is, in some ways.
I think. But hopefully, yeah, people, if you listen to this episode, you'll take something away. But please, yeah, let us know what you think. What's your take on it? And also, like, go out there and have those conversations with people and see where you end up.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us in this conversation today. I think our our outro became much more spiritual than I was certainly anticipating.
I know what happens when you make the space for it, Elizabeth.
Isn't it just? Yeah, so
Thank you for listening.
go well, friends.